Hey, welcome to Hail Chatter. Thanks for joining us on this Tuesday. We appreciate you joining us every 2 weeks for our podcast, Hail Chatter, where weather meets restoration. I'm meteorologist Taylor Cox here with Collin Hunt, and today we're talking about soft versus hard hail.
Taylor, this is an interesting conversation because we get this even at Hail Trace often about this hail that tends to be softer, appears softer versus hail that is harder. And why do we see that happen? What creates that in a storm? So I know you've done some different research, and why don't you kind of go through like starting off, how does hail form? And then we can jump into actually looking at what creates that soft versus hard hail.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is important to roofers. They are always asking this on social media whenever we do our live broadcasts. We will look at the radar, we'll look at those live storms. And this was actually brought to me as well by a roofer. They asked, is this going to be soft or hard hail? And I said, I'm not quite sure what you mean. And I did some research on this. Colin, you've gotten this question as you mentioned before as well. So let's get right into it. Let's start with the process of how hail forms. So I'm showing you a video right now of how hail forms, and I'm going to break this down and go right into the different processes that you can see for hail formation, the composition of a hailstone, and then we'll talk about exactly what it means to be hard versus soft hail, or do we even know? So let's talk about this here. Here's your video. So your storm, it's a thunderstorm. It's a classic storm. You've got your big cumulus clouds. Every thunderstorm is made up of updrafts and downdrafts. As the name suggests, an updraft is air that is rising into the thunderstorm. This helps to fuel or sustain the strength of the storm. And the downdraft, just the opposite, is a column of air that is racing to the ground, usually along with rain or strong wind. Okay, we know that thunderstorms are really tall. And the higher you get into the thunderstorm, the colder it is. And whenever temperatures drop below freezing, you're going to get near freezing, or what we like to call as meteorologists, supercooled water droplets. Now, these droplets, supercooled water droplets, are droplets that are still a liquid, even though the temperature is below freezing, below 0 degrees Celsius. Now, these droplets will collide with other particles in the storm, creating a ball of ice. There's your hail, right? This hail will continue to cycle and grow in the thunderstorm, rising up with the updraft and falling down with the downdraft until the hailstone is too big and too heavy that the downdraft cannot sustain its weight. So it's going to fall to the ground or onto a roof or onto the top of your car.
Yeah, and Taylor, what amazes me about this is that this updraft that you're pointing to is capable of creating some really large hailstones. Like I mean, some of the records we have here in the United States, like Texas, I know was hit by like 7.25 inch hail. That was back in 2021, and then the U.S. record is 8 inches in diameter for that hailstone. I think that was in South Dakota back in 2010. And for that updraft to be able to create that kind of hailstone to me is astonishing.
Absolutely. And I knew that you were going to talk about this today, Colin. So I actually brought the largest hailstone with me to really show you how large this thing is. 7.87 inches in diameter. It's very, very heavy. This is a replica of the largest hailstone. Now, here it is. I think you can see it in the camera. Just a massive stone. Colin, which way? I'm going to give you kind of a round the hailstone here. Which way do you think this fell whenever it was falling to the ground? Tell me when to stop.
Stop.
Right here?
Yeah, I think it would kind of flatten out as it's falling. It kind of more horizontal.
Yeah, well, and you're correct. That is great intuition because what happens as it's falling in the sky is it's melting right here. So you can see that this is a lot more spiky and this is a lot smoother on this edge of the hailstone. So this hailstone was actually probably a lot larger in the storm. And then as it fell to the ground, it flattened out right here, melted a little bit. And this is what we actually measured once it got to the ground. And then Hail Trace created a replica here. So, just to give you an idea of how large those hailstones are, and you're exactly right, how strong the updraft has to be to sustain such a large hailstone.
And I just want to set the record straight there. I'm not a meteorologist and I didn't do any research on that. So the fact I got that right on the angle of that hailstone, I'm impressed with myself. So,
I love it. You're learning just as these roofers are and contractors that are listening to this podcast. Everyone's going to know enough about meteorology pretty soon. But I have another fun fact for you. Did you know that you can actually tell how many times a hailstone has cycled through the thunderstorm by looking at the middle of the hailstone? You can see little rings, kind of like a tree. You know how a tree has rings, and we can see how old a tree is based by the rings or the eye of the tree. A hailstone is not dissimilar to that. You can look and see how many times a hailstone has cycled through the thunderstorm by looking at the rings of the stone. So each of these rings actually tells you something different about the hailstone. The white and cloudy ring is formed by a dry process called deposition. This is when water vapor turns directly into ice when making contact with the hailstone. So the appearance is much cloudier. We've got tiny air bubbles that are trapped within the stone, kind of creating that milky look. And that's frozen. Those air bubbles are frozen inside of the hailstone. Now, the clearer and shiny rings are formed by a wet process. This is when supercooled liquid makes contact and freezes to the hail, kind of like what you would see during the winter with freezing rain as it accumulates ice onto your power lines or tree limbs or onto the sidewalk outside of your house. So that's the clearer and shiny ring that's formed. Now, the faster the hailstone grows, the more likely it is to trap small air bubbles and create that cloudy or milky appearance.
so what you're saying is that there's basically two ways that those rings start getting created around the hailstone while it's traveling through the cloud, right? So it's that wet process and dry. The dry process, including more air, and the wet process with that super cooled, a little bit clearer rings. Is that kind of correct?
Yes, yeah, two main ways that are recognized for hail formation, that wet process and dry process. And next time you see a hailstone, next time you have a big hailstorm, go out, look at those stones, see if you can see how many times it made those cycles through the thunderstorm. You can look at that by the rings. And then once you take a look at that, send us the picture here at Hail Trace. We want to know exactly where you found that hailstone.
So that is how hail is formed. Now, going to our conversation today is soft versus hard hail. What makes the difference? Why do we see sometimes soft hail being created compared to that hard hail? I know for roofers, for adjusters, for others in the restoration industry, uh, kind of understanding this because they are out in the field often. They're looking at roofs, they're seeing damage. So I'm very curious on what actually goes into creating this soft hail compared to hard hail.
Right. It's not just enough to know exactly how large the hail was, but we want to know what type of hail it is as well. But this is a very difficult question because I think that we first have to answer the question, what is soft hail? What is hard hail? Now, traditionally, what we would describe as soft hail is that type of hail that explodes on impact, kind of like a snowball. And you can see it in your hail videos and you can see it whenever you look out your window and it's hailing. And these hailstones are just exploding on impact. But hard hail is going to be that hail that really makes a bigger impact onto our structures, or that's the traditional thinking, right? Well, I did some research and I asked some meteorologists, because we have so many meteorologists here at Hail Trace, it was easy to find one, and ask these questions. And what we've determined, and what a lot of the research tells us, that a lot of people believe that we can tell how extensive the impact on a roof is because of the density of a hailstone. So a low density hailstone would be that soft hail. and a high density hailstone would be that hard hail. However, the more we researched this, the more that we found that may not always be true. So, others have found that there's very little correlation between high density and hard hailstone. We believe that the hardness of the hail can actually be determined by the material of the hail. And here's the tricky thing about this: it's very difficult to know that. It's actually near impossible to know that based on just looking at the radar. So we really need the ground truth, which is why it's really important to take pictures of the hailstorms that you see, send them in to us. That can give us a lot more information on this storm.
Taylor, it's really interesting that you brought that up about the density, and a lot of people thinking that, hey, it's just the density that creates the soft versus hard hail. Because when I first was looking into this, and one of the top articles I found, it was this journal that somebody was talking about, like, hey, yeah, this density was the reason why we'll see soft hail. But it makes sense what you're explaining of, like, hey, it's actually the material of the hail that tends to make the soft versus hard hail.
So we like to use the words hard versus soft hail or high density versus low density hail interchangeably. However, that is a common misconception. Hard hail versus soft hail are made up of a lot of different things. Hard hail, of course, is going to withstand impact to the ground or to the roof or to the roof of your car. But soft hail is going to be those hailstones that almost explode on impact, right? They don't withstand the contact onto different objects, different surfaces, different structures. However, low density hail is formed by that dry process or primarily by a dry process, connecting or collecting air bubbles into a hailstone, making it very milky, or I liked the word that you used, Colin, murky looking hailstone. A high density hailstone is going to be formed by a wet process, kind of like whenever we see accumulating freezing rain onto the surface, it falls as rain. However, once it makes contact with the surface, it freezes as ice. That same process happens in the clouds inside this thunderstorm, where as this hailstone makes contact with supercooled water droplets, the second it makes contact, they freeze as ice onto the hailstone, making it oftentimes heavier and a higher density. However, even though we can identify low density versus high density hailstones, that doesn't necessarily correlate to soft versus hard hailstone.
So that brings me to this idea of, okay, what do you do with this information of this conversation of soft hail versus hard hail when you see storms having these different elements? Like, as someone in the restoration industry, as a contractor, adjuster, what do you do with this soft hail? And I would say there's three things to kind of note around this. First, it is really important to use multiple tools to track storms. So not only using maps to track storms, but also getting like on the ground data of NOAA reports and social media images. Those are going to be really important in this process to find areas to work, to find areas that you're going to start targeting with your sales teams. And that's why at HailTrace, we have all four of those: the meteorologist maps, algorithm maps, NOAA reports, and social media images all in one place. And then the second thing here I would say is being able to just create systems for your teams that goes beyond the storm, right? Whether you're in the middle of storm season, whether you're in the off season, whether you're seeing soft hail, hard hail, so you have systems in place that are going to be able to work those leads to a sale. The idea for this, I mean, this is from a book, Atomic Habits. The author there quotes, like, you fall to the level of your systems. So you don't rise to the level of your goals. You always fall to the level of your systems.
Yeah, and what you're saying here, Colin, is not dissimilar from what I've read in some of these papers. I mean, they're meteorological papers that talk about the differences between hard and soft hail. You know, hard being a lot more durable, soft hail being not as durable, you know, exploding on the ground like snowballs. They talk about the different processes that go in here, but they also mention that the material of the roof matters. How old is it? That matters as well. They recognize that it's not just about the hail itself, but it's also about the impact that it is. It's also about the structure that it's impacting. And what I'm hearing from you is that It's not about the hail itself, but it's also about how you're getting out in the field, how your team is set up, the resources that you're using also matters here as well, which I like to talk about this all the time. It's not just the weather process, it's also the human interaction afterwards.
And you push on a good point there, that which goes into the third section here of hail size does not equal damage. I mean, this is intuitive, I think, to people in the restoration industry, right? A brand new roof that gets hit by golf ball size hail, it doesn't, there's a low risk of that getting damage. And there's multiple things that go into finding damage on roofs, right? So the age of the roof, the amount of times a hailstorm has hit a property, the shingles being used, all of these play into finding that storm damage.
Yeah, and I think that's important for the homeowner to know as well. Whenever you're a roofer and you're talking to a homeowner saying, "Can I inspect your roof? You just got hit with golf ball sized hail." And they say, "Golf ball size? That's not very large." But if that roof is 10 years old, that's going to do some more damage than the homeowner 2 miles down that got hit with baseball sized hail, whose roof is only a year old. I think that's important for the roofers to tell the homeowners as well so that they understand the impact that could be going on their roof just above their heads.
Which is what is really exciting for me at with us being at Hail Trace is we're actively trying to innovate and be able to start answering that question of like, okay, what properties have storm damage, rather than just saying, oh yeah, here's all the areas that had 2-inch hail, right? And some of the things that we talked about before, right? Using multiple sources of data to figure out where you're going to work and focus in on that storm.
I find this very almost comical because we had one question and we gave about 7 different answers, hard versus soft hail. And we said, well, there's a lot that goes into that. But then we also have multiple sources of data all wrapped up into one app. So I feel like we kind of went back and forth here, but I like the answer that we got to.
Yeah, it's a great conversation. And guys, if you have any questions around soft versus hard hail, feel free to let us know.
And don't forget to send us your pictures of hail. I want to see if you have any good hail pictures with the rings that you can see the different processes of how that hail was formed. Go back in your camera roll and look at your hail pictures. Send them to me if you find really good pictures of the hail rings. I love to see those. Actually, before we wrap up here, Colin, did you know that in really high wind events, whenever there's hail with these really strong thunderstorms that have high wind associated with them, that wind is going to sweep up things like small frogs and small objects. And those small objects have actually frozen inside of little hailstones. I'll include a picture of it here in the podcast.
Wow, that so now I did not know that. That's really cool. So yeah, if somebody
It
has a
sounds
picture
silly,
of
it's
like
true.
an object, yeah, I mean, if somebody has a picture of an object inside of one of these hailstones, like a frog, I mean, please send it. That would be really cool to see.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us today. We'll be back in 2 weeks on Tuesday. Easy to remember, 2 weeks on Tuesday. Thanks for joining us today. We are Hail Chatter, a Hail Trace podcast. We'll see you back here in 2 weeks.